This is Chapter 40 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 17 of Volume 2. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what had happened could no longer be overcome, and at length resolving to suppress every particular in which her sister was concerned, and preparing her to be surprised, she related to her the next morning the chief of the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself. So Elizabeth tells Jane everything that happened with her and Mr. Darcy, but she doesn't tell her anything about Mr. Darcy's influence over Mr. Bingley. Miss Bennet's astonishment was soon lessened by the strong sisterly partiality, which made any admiration of Elizabeth appear perfectly natural, and all surprise was shortly lost in other feelings. She was sorry that Mr. Darcy should have delivered his sentiments in a manner so little suited to recommend them, but still more was she grieved for the unhappiness which her sister's refusal must have given him. So Jane is shocked for a little bit, but then because she cares so much about Elizabeth, she just kind of says, well, it's not surprising that someone loves my sister because Elizabeth is great. She's sorry for Mr. Darcy giving such an obnoxious proposal, but then she's even more sorry that Elizabeth rejected him and caused him pain. His being so sure of succeeding was wrong, said she, and certainly ought not to have appeared, but consider how much it must increase his disappointment. Indeed, replied Elizabeth, I am heartily sorry for him, but he has other feelings which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. You do not blame me, however, for refusing him. Blame you? Oh, no. But you blame me for having spoken so warmly of Wickham? No, I do not know that you were wrong in saying what you did. But you will know it when I have told you what happened the very next day. So Jane says that it was wrong, Mr. Darcy, to assume that Elizabeth would immediately say yes, but it must have made him even more disappointed. Elizabeth says she feels sorry for him too, but he has all those other feelings, like the fact that he's annoyed, that she's less than him, etc., that will help him get over it, Elizabeth thinks. Elizabeth also says you must think that I'm a bad person for talking so warmly. In this case, like, passionately, excitedly, so kind of the fact that she was defending him very eagerly, and also that there may have been an undercurrent still of Elizabeth liking Wickham in all of that. Jane says, no, there's nothing wrong in what you said about Wickham, and there's nothing wrong in you refusing Mr. Darcy either. And then Elizabeth says, you may think differently after you hear about what happened the following day, meaning Mr. Darcy's letter. She then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of its contents as far as they concerned George Wickham. So she doesn't say anything again about Mr. Darcy stopping Bingley from being with Jane, but she does mention everything that had to do with George Wickham. What a stroke was this for poor Jane, who would willingly have gone through the world without believing that so much wickedness existed in the whole race of mankind as was here collected in one individual. Nor was Darcy's vindication, though grateful to her feelings, capable of consoling her for such discovery. Most earnestly did she labor to prove the probability of error and seek to clear one without involving the other. So again, we see Jane being very kind and generous, and she is happy that Mr. Darcy wasn't as wrong as they originally thought in this circumstance, but she can't fathom how so much evil could be in one person, and she can't fathom how so much evil could be in the whole human race, let alone in one person in Wickham. So she keeps trying to think of a reason to maybe make something into a misunderstanding, to excuse both of them and make neither one of them guilty of wrongdoing. This will not do, said Elizabeth. You never will be able to make both of them good for anything. Take your choice, but you must be satisfied with only one. There is but such a quantity of merit between them, just enough to make one good sort of man, and of late it has been shifting about pretty much. For my part, I am inclined to believe it all Mr. Darcy's, but you shall do as you choose. So Elizabeth says, no, there's only enough goodness to make one of these people a good person, and Elizabeth is now convinced that that good person is Mr. Darcy and no longer Mr. Wickham. It was some time, however, before a smile could be extorted from Jane. I do not know when I have been more shocked, said she. Wickham is so very bad, it is almost past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy, dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered. Such a disappointment, and with the knowledge of your ill opinion too, and having to relate such a thing of his sister. It is really too distressing. I am sure you must feel it so. Oh no, my regret and compassion are all done away by seeing you so full of both. I know you will do him such ample justice that I am growing every moment more unconcerned and indifferent. Your profusion makes me saving, and if you lament over him much longer, my heart will be as light as a feather. Poor Wickham! There is such an expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and gentleness in his manner. There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of those two young men. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it. I never thought Mr. Darcy so deficient in the appearance of it as you used to do. And yet I meant to be uncommonly clever in taking so decided a dislike to him without any reason. It is such a spur to one's genius, such an opening for wit, to have a dislike of that kind. One may be continually abusive without saying anything just, but one cannot always be laughing at a man without now and then stumbling on something witty. Lizzie, when you first read that letter, I am sure you could not treat the matter as you do now. Indeed, I could not. I was uncomfortable enough. I was very uncomfortable. I may say unhappy. And with no one to speak of what I felt, no Jane to comfort me, and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you. How unfortunate that you should have used such very strong expressions in speaking of Wickham to Mr. Darcy, for now they do appear wholly undeserved. Certainly, but the misfortune of speaking with bitterness is a most natural consequence of the prejudices I had been encouraging. There is one point on which I want your advice. I want to be told whether I ought or ought not to make our acquaintance in general understand Wickham's character. Miss Bennet paused a little and then replied, Surely there can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully. What is your own opinion? That it ought not to be attempted. Mr. Darcy has not authorized me to make his communication public. On the contrary, every particular relative to his sister was meant to be kept as much as possible to myself, and if I endeavor to undeceive people as to the rest of his conduct, who will believe me? The general prejudice against Mr. Darcy is so violent that it would be the death of half the good people of Meryton to attempt to place him in an amiable light. I am not equal to it. Wickham will soon be gone, and therefore it will not signify to anybody here what he really is. Some time hence it will be all found out, and then we may laugh at their stupidity in not knowing it before. At present I will say nothing about it. You are quite right. To have his errors made public might ruin him forever. He is now, perhaps, sorry for what he has done and anxious to re-establish his character. We must not make him desperate. So Elizabeth and Jane talk over a few things pertaining to Mr. Darcy's letter. So they mention how shocked they both are that Wickham is this terrible person. Elizabeth makes this very witty comment that whoever educated Darcy and Wickham made a mistake. So one has all the appearance of goodness and one actually has all the goodness. So Wickham appears very pleasant and charming and good, but is truly a bad person. And Mr. Darcy does not appear like a good person because he's so reserved and obnoxious, but he is a decent man. They talk about that. Elizabeth feels very comforted by Jane, so she says that when she first read the letter, she was very troubled, couldn't talk about it with this like lighthearted sort of witty banter that she now discusses everything over with Jane, and said that and with no one to speak of what I felt, no Jane to comfort me and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you. So Elizabeth says, I wish you were there to tell me that I hadn't been such a bad person in all of my actions, with which Jane, of course, does at this point in the novel. Then they talk about something a little more plot heavy than character. So Elizabeth wonders if she should tell other people what Wickham has done and if he's exposed his character, so expose that he's a bad person and that he tried to elope with Georgiana Darcy for her money, and let people know that this is the sort of person he is. They both ultimately decide against it because, for one thing, Wickham is leaving, so he won't be in the picture anymore and won't be able to cause any damage or any trouble if he's not in Meryton any longer. So that's for leaving. The other thing that Jane says is that if Wickham were to try and redeem himself and make a fresh start, especially if he's feeling sorry for how he's acted, he wouldn't be able to do that with this information out there. Elizabeth also points out that Mr. Darcy has not given her permission to share any of this story, so she cannot tell anyone this because it would perhaps embarrass Georgiana Darcy. It would reflect poorly on her reputation. Unfortunately, that would be a common misconception at the time that Georgiana would have some sort of blame for running away with Wickham, even though it seems that Wickham had really manipulated Georgiana. So, because she doesn't want to hurt Georgiana Darcy or even Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth decides that she will not reveal this story. The tumult of Elizabeth's mind was allayed by this conversation. She had got rid of 2 of the secrets which had weighed on her for a fortnight, and was certain of a willing listener in Jane, whenever she might wish to talk again of either. But there was still something lurking behind, of which prudence forbade the disclosure. She dared not relate the other half of Mr. Darcy's letter, nor explain to her sister how sincerely she had been valued by his friend. Here was knowledge in which no one could partake, and she was sensible that nothing less than a perfect understanding between the parties could justify her in throwing off this last encumbrance of mystery. And then, said she, if that very improbable event should ever take place, I should merely be able to tell what Bingley may tell in a much more agreeable manner himself. The liberty of communication cannot be mine till it has lost all its value. So Elizabeth is still sort of tormented by the knowledge that Bingley really did like Jane and that Mr. Darcy played a key role in separating them. She wants to tell Jane this, but it really can't come from her. She thinks that if Mr. Bingley ever did end up meeting with Jane again and liking her and expressing his real feelings, then Mr. Bingley would be able to tell Jane everything. But at this point, it's just too painful, and it doesn't seem like there's a chance that Bingley and Jane will be together. She is now, on being settled at home, at leisure to observe the real state of her sister's spirits. Jane was not happy. She still cherished a very tender affection for Bingley. Having never even fancied herself in love before, her regard had all the warmth of first attachment, and from her age and disposition, greater steadiness than first attachments often boast. And so fervently did she value his remembrance, and prefer him to every other man, that all her good sense and all her attention to the feelings of her friends were requisite to check the indulgence of those regrets which must have been injurious to her own health and their tranquillity. So Jane is still definitely not over Mr. Bingley. He was her first love, her first attachment, but Jane's a little bit older than when people typically fall in first love. So she's able to treat it with like a sincerity. There's not really that puppy love aspect of it. She really seriously did love him, so it was an intense first love, but it's also kind of a maturer first love because she's a little bit older. So Jane just sort of focuses all of her energy on being nice and pleasant and cheerful and helping the people around her to distract her from this. But it's still there, it's still under the surface, all of this sadness. Well, Lizzie, said Mrs. Bennet one day, what is your opinion now of this sad business of Jane's? For my part, I am determined never to speak of it again to anybody. I told my sister Philip so the other day, but I cannot find out that Jane saw anything of him in London. Well, he's a very undeserving young man, and I do not suppose there is the least chance in the world of her ever getting him now. There's no talk of his coming to Netherfield again in the summer, and I have inquired of everybody, too, who is likely to know. I do not believe that he will ever live at Netherfield any more. Oh, well, it is just as he chooses. Nobody wants him to come, though I shall always say that he used my daughter extremely ill, and if I was her, I would not have put up with it. Well, my comfort is I am sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done. Mrs. Bennet. So she says, what do you think of what's gone on between Bingley and Jane? I think that Bingley is a horrible person, and I'm never going to talk about him again. I just told my sister yesterday that I was never going to talk about him again. So as usual, Mrs. Bennet proves herself to be inconsistent between some of her words and her actions. So she says, I'm never going to talk about Bingley again. Of course, she brought him up the other day with Mrs. Phillips, and she's bringing him up again now with Elizabeth. And she takes some consolation, quote unquote, in the fact that Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he'll regret what he's done. So a very melodramatic Mrs. Bennet reaction to all of this. But as Elizabeth could not receive comfort from any such expectation, she made no answer. So because Elizabeth can't feel relieved that, Jane will just die of a broken heart and then Bingley will be sorry, she just doesn't say anything to Mrs. Bennet. Well, Lizzie, continued her mother soon afterwards, and so the Collinses live very comfortable, do they? Well, I only hope it will last. And what sort of table do they keep? Charlotte is an excellent manager, I dare say. If she is half as sharp as her mother, she is saving enough. There's nothing extravagant in their housekeeping, I dare say. No, nothing at all. A great deal of good management depend upon it. Yes, yes, they will take care not to outrun their income. They will never be distressed for money. Well, what good it may do them, and so I suppose they often talk of having Longbourn when your father is dead. They look upon it quite as their own, I dare say, whenever that happens. It was a subject which they could not mention before me. No, it would have been strange if they had, but I make no doubt they often talk of it between themselves. Well, if they can be easy with an estate that is not lawfully their own, so much the better. I should be ashamed of having one that was only entailed to me. So Mrs. Bennet is still very salty about Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins. She says, "Oh, did they talk to you about how they're gonna get Longbourn when your dad is dead?" Elizabeth says, "No, they can't talk about that in front of me." And then Mrs. Bennet says, "Well, I know that they talk about it in the privacy of their own home when no one's around." And then she also shows that she still doesn't understand really what an entail is, because she says that it's not lawful that they have, that they will inherit Longbourn, although it is a legal document and procedure. So we can all kind of laugh at Mrs. Bennet. I think she offers some vent to maybe our frustrations as readers, but also a little bit of comic relief. And that is chapter 40.